The metal box sits heavy in my lap, its surface cold against my palms despite the Texas heat beating through the ranch house windows. 3 months I've owned in this place, 3 months since Lionel Edwards changed everything, and I still can't bring myself to force open this final secret he left behind. The key he mentioned in his letter, the one that supposedly unlocks everything, remains as elusive as the old rancher himself had been in life. My fingers trace the worn edges of the box, feeling the weight of answers I'm not sure I'm ready to discover. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story gets wild and I need to know you're with me on this journey. The irony isn't lost on me. At 17, I'd spent my entire life believing I had no one, that I was just another forgotten kid aging out of the system. Now here I sit in a house that's mine, on land that stretches farther than I can walk in a day, holding the final piece of a puzzle I never knew existed. The afternoon sun slants through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that dance like the memories I've been collecting since that first phone call from James Howard, the lawyer who turned my world upside down with 5 impossible words. "You've inherited a ranch, son, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, back to that gray February morning, when everything I thought I knew about my life crumbled and rebuilt itself in the span of a single conversation. I was stacking boxes in the storage room of Henderson County Children's Home, my 18th birthday looming like a cliff edge just 3 weeks away. The other kids called it aging out, but I preferred to think of it as finally getting free. Martha Bailey, the director, had been on my case about college applications and job prospects, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and resignation that all the staff develop when dealing with kids like me. Kids with no family, no connections, no safety net waiting beyond these walls. The phone call came during lunch. Martha appeared in the doorway of the dining hall, her face wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Something between bewilderment and excitement. "James Howard wants to speak with you," she said, and the name meant nothing to me then. Just another social worker or counselor or well-meaning volunteer who thought they could fix what 18 years in the system had broken. But James Howard wasn't a social worker. He was a lawyer from Millfield, Texas, a town I'd never heard of, calling about a man named Lionel Edwards, another stranger whose name carried no weight in my memory. The conversation that followed felt like stepping into someone else's life, like I'd picked up the wrong phone call entirely. Lionel Edwards had owned a cattle ranch outside Millfield for 43 years. He died alone in his sleep 2 weeks earlier, at the age of 71, leaving behind a will that mentioned me by name. Not just mentioned, but designated me as his sole beneficiary. "Everything," James Howard said, his voice careful and professional over the crackling connection. "The ranch, the house, the livestock, the equipment, everything goes to you." I remember asking him to repeat himself, certain I'd misheard, then asking him to spell my name to confirm he had the right person. Then sitting in stunned silence as he read portions of the will aloud, hearing my full name, my birth date, even the name of the children's home where I'd spent the last 8 years. Lionel Edwards had known exactly who I was, where to find me, how to reach me, but I had never heard of him. The only clue came in a sealed letter, James Howard explained, one that Lionel had left specifically for me, to be delivered only after his death, along with a metal box that required a key whose location Lionel had promised would become clear once I read his words. The whole thing sounded like something from a movie, too strange and wonderful to be happening to someone like me. Martha Bailey drove me to Millfield herself, making the 6-hour journey in her ancient Honda while I stared out the window at the changing landscape, watching the familiar pine forests of East Texas give way to the rolling hills and endless sky of ranch country. She kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, probably worried I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was. My entire understanding of my own story had shifted overnight, and I was heading toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. James Howard's office sat on Main Street in downtown Millfield, squeezed between a feed store and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. He was younger than I'd expected from his voice, maybe 40, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of steady handshake that suggested reliability. His office walls were covered with photographs of local ranches, cattle, and what I assumed were satisfied clients shaking hands over completed deals. The letter sat on his desk in a manila envelope, my name written across it in careful, angular handwriting. Lionel Edwards had beautiful penmanship, the kind they don't teach anymore, each letter formed with deliberate precision. James Howard handed it to me with the solemnity of a sacred ritual, then excused himself to give me privacy while I read. The paper felt expensive, heavy stock that crinkled softly as I unfolded it. The date at the top was from just 6 months earlier, suggesting Lionel had known his time was limited when he wrote it. His words were direct, unadorned by sentiment or flowery language, but they hit me like physical blows. "Jeremy," he began, and seeing my name in his handwriting made something twist in my chest. "I know you don't know me, but I've known about you since the day you were born. I am your grandfather, your mother's father, and I have spent every day of the last 18 years regretting the choices that kept us apart." The letter went on to explain things that shattered every assumption I'd built about my origins. My mother, Sarah Garcia, had been his only child, born late in his life to a woman who died when Sarah was just 12. He'd raised her alone on the ranch, perhaps too strictly, certainly too stubbornly. When she fell in love at 19 with a man Lionel disapproved of, their arguments had escalated until she left home in anger, pregnant with me, swearing never to return. Lionel had been too proud to reach out, too certain that she would come back on her own once the baby arrived and she needed help. But Sarah never came back. She died in a car accident when I was 6 months old, and by the time Lionel learned of her death, I had already disappeared into the foster system. He tried to find me then, hired investigators, worked with lawyers, but the system had closed ranks around my privacy, and his age and single status worked against him in the eyes of social workers who saw him as just another old man wanting to claim a child for the wrong reasons. He'd never stopped looking, though, never stopped hoping. The letter detailed years of searching, of false leads and dead ends, of bureaucratic obstacles and legal roadblocks. He'd finally found me 2 years ago, but by then I was nearly 16, settled in what seemed like a stable placement, and he'd convinced himself that disrupting my life might do more harm than good. So he'd watch from a distance, gathering information about my progress in school, my interests, my character, waiting for the right moment to make contact. That moment never came. His health began failing faster than expected, and he realized he was running out of time to build the relationship he'd always dreamed of having with his grandson. The letter was his apology, his explanation, and his attempt to give me everything he'd wanted to share during the years we'd lost. The ranch was everything and nothing like I'd imagined. James Howard drove me out there after I finished reading the letter, following a gravel road that seemed to stretch forever between rolling pastures dotted with cattle. The house sat on a low hill, a sprawling single-story structure with a wraparound porch and metal roof that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. It looked solid, permanent, like it had grown from the earth itself rather than being built upon it. But it also looked lonely. The paint was fading, the porch sagged slightly on one side, and weeds had begun to claim the flower beds that someone, presumably my mother, had planted decades ago. Lionel had lived here alone for so long that the house seemed to echo with solitude even before we stepped inside. The interior told the story of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort somewhere along the way. The furniture was functional but sparse, the walls mostly bare except for a few photographs of cattle and ranch operations. The kitchen was clean but impersonal, like a hotel room occupied by someone passing through rather than making a home. It was in the master bedroom that I found the first real traces of the family I'd never known. A dresser top held framed photographs, most of them faded with age. My mother as a child, grinning gap-toothed astride a pony. My mother as a teenager, serious and beautiful in a high school graduation photo. And tucked behind the others, a hospital picture of a tiny baby in a pink blanket with Sarah Garcia written on the back in that same careful handwriting. Me. He'd had a picture of me all these years, probably the only one that existed from those first months of my life. I stood there holding it, trying to reconcile the infant in the photo with the teenager staring back at me from the dresser mirror. Trying to imagine what my life might have been like if pride and stubbornness hadn't kept us apart. James Howard cleared his throat behind me, reminding me of his presence. "There's more," he said gently. "The metal box Lionel mentioned in his letter. It's in the study, along with some other documents you'll need to review." The inheritance isn't quite as straightforward as I initially explained. The study was the most personal room in the house, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk that looked like it had been carved from a single tree. The metal box sat in the center of the desk, roughly the size of a shoebox but heavier, made from steel that had been painted black but now showed rust around the edges. No visible lock, no obvious way to open it, just smooth metal surfaces that revealed nothing about their contents. Beside the box lay a stack of legal documents, property deeds, tax records, bank statements, and financial reports that painted a picture of the inheritance I was receiving. The ranch encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, currently home to over 300 head of cattle. The house, the barns, the equipment, everything was paid for, debt-free, generating enough income to support a comfortable lifestyle for someone who knew how to manage it properly. But there was a catch, as there always is with inheritances that seem too good to be true. The problem had a name, and that name was Zachary Reyes, Lionel's nephew, the son of his deceased sister, who had been contesting the will since the day it was filed for probate. Zachary lived in Houston, worked as a real estate developer, and had very specific plans for what should happen to his uncle's ranch. Plans that involved selling the land to a company that specialized in converting agricultural property into suburban housing developments. James Howard explained the situation with the careful neutrality of a lawyer who'd seen too many family disputes turn ugly. Zachary was arguing that Lionel had been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will, that leaving everything to a grandson he'd never met was evidence of diminished capacity. He was also questioning my identity, demanding DNA tests and extensive documentation to prove I was actually Sarah Garcia's son. The legal challenge could tie up the inheritance for months, maybe years. In the meantime, I was welcome to live on the ranch and help manage the day-to-day operations. But I couldn't sell anything, couldn't make major changes, couldn't truly call it mine until the courts resolved the dispute. It was a cruel kind of limbo, being given everything and nothing at the same time. But there was hope in the metal box, or at least Lionel seemed to think so. His letter had been cryptic about its contents, mentioning only that it contained proof of things that would make my claim unshakable. The key he'd written would be found where family memories were strongest, where love had been built one day at a time through years of shared work and simple presence. I spent my first night on the ranch lying awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to sounds I'd never heard before. Cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through grass, the settling creaks of a house that had weathered decades of Texas storms. It should have been peaceful, but my mind raced with questions and possibilities, with the weight of inheriting not just property, but the responsibility of proving I deserved it. The next morning, I met the ranch's foreman, Jose White, a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked for Lionel for over 20 years. He was polite but cautious, clearly uncertain about taking orders from a teenager who'd never set foot on a ranch before yesterday. His handshake was firm, his eyes evaluating, and I could tell he was measuring me against some internal standard I probably couldn't meet. Jose showed me around the property, explaining the daily routines of feeding, watering, and monitoring the cattle. He pointed out fence lines that needed repair, equipment that required maintenance, and a dozen other tasks that kept a ranch functioning. It was overwhelming, like being handed the controls to a machine I didn't understand, but there was also something deeply satisfying about the work. By the end of that first week, I was exhausted, sunburned, and sore in muscles I didn't know I had. But I was also beginning to understand why Lionel had loved this place, why he'd spent his entire adult life caring for this land and these animals. There was a rhythm to ranch work, a sense of purpose that came from knowing your efforts directly supported life and growth. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, while I was cleaning out the barn loft. Jose had mentioned that Lionel used to spend time up there, especially in the evenings after the day's work was done. It was a peaceful spot, with a view across the entire ranch and comfortable old chairs positioned to catch the sunset. I'd been putting off exploring it, partly from respect for Lionel's memory and partly from fear of what I might find. But the loft needed cleaning, and I couldn't avoid it forever. Among the usual collection of old equipment and forgotten supplies, I discovered something that made my heart race. A small wooden box carved with intricate designs and hidden behind a stack of hay bales in the corner where the roof met the floor. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a key. Not just any key, but one that looked like it belonged to the metal box sitting on Lionel's desk. The same dark metal, the same style of craftsmanship, clearly made as a pair. But more than that, the wooden box itself told a story. Carved into its lid was a heart containing two sets of initials, LE plus MR, surrounded by a date from 48 years ago. Martha Rodriguez. I'd seen the name on some of the older photographs in Lionel's bedroom. A beautiful woman with kind eyes who appeared in pictures spanning several years before disappearing from the collection entirely. My grandmother, I realized, the woman who died when my mother was 12, leaving Lionel to raise Sarah alone. The key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty house. Inside the metal box lay treasures that made Zachary Reyes's legal challenge seem petty and pointless. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, baptismal records, and a family Bible that traced the Edwards lineage back 6 generations. But more importantly, there were letters, dozens of them, written by my mother during the years after she left home. Letters that Lionel had never opened, that had been returned to sender or forwarded through multiple addresses as Sarah moved around the state, trying to build a life for herself and her unborn child. Letters that revealed a daughter who missed her father desperately, who wanted to come home but was too proud to admit she'd been wrong, too scared to face his judgment. The final letter was different, written in a shaky hand that suggested illness or exhaustion. It was dated just 2 weeks before the car accident that killed her, and it contained the words that would have changed everything if Lionel had received them in time. She was coming home. She wanted to introduce him to his grandson, to let him be the grandfather she'd always known he would be. She was sorry for the years they'd lost, ready to put pride aside for the sake of family. But the letter had arrived 3 days after her funeral, forwarded through a chain of old addresses to reach a man who no longer had a daughter to forgive or a grandson to meet. Lionel had kept it all these years, along with all the others, as evidence of his own failures and regrets. Armed with the contents of the metal box, James Howard was able to demolish Zachary Reyes's legal challenge within a matter of weeks. The documentation was overwhelming, the paper trail clear and unbroken, the DNA evidence unnecessary in the face of such comprehensive proof. More than that, the letters revealed a family history that painted Zachary's claims in an ugly light, showing his own father's estrangement from Lionel, and his family's long-standing resentment over being excluded from ranch operations. But winning the legal battle was easier than winning the acceptance of the community. Millfield was a small town where families had known each other for generations, where newcomers were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of trust. I was not just a newcomer, but an outsider with no understanding of ranch life, no connection to the local culture, no reason to be there except for an accident of genetics. The skepticism was subtle but persistent. Conversations that stopped when I entered the feed store, polite but distant interactions at the diner, the sense that people were watching and waiting for me to fail. Some of it was probably natural caution, but some of it felt personal, as if my very existence was an insult to Lionel's memory. The turning point came during a late spring storm that threatened to flood the lower pastures where most of the cattle were grazing. Jose and I had been monitoring the weather reports all day, watching the radar images that showed a massive system moving in from the west. By evening, it was clear we were going to get hit hard, and we had maybe 2 hours to move 300 head of cattle to higher ground. It should have been impossible with just 2 people, but the storm was too dangerous to wait for help from neighboring ranches. Jose looked at me across the kitchen table where we'd spread out maps of the property, his expression grim but determined. "We can try," he said, "but it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. You sure you're up for it?" I wasn't sure of anything except that I couldn't let Lionel's cattle die because I was too inexperienced or too scared to try saving them. We saddled horses in the growing darkness, loaded the truck with emergency supplies, and headed out into the storm as the first raindrops began to fall. The next 6 hours tested every skill Jose had taught me and several I didn't know I possessed. Moving cattle in good weather requires patience and strategy, understanding how the animals think and react, knowing when to push and when to wait. Moving them in a thunderstorm, with lightning splitting the sky and rain turning the ground to mud, was like trying to solve a puzzle while the world ended around us. But we did it, somehow through a combination of luck, determination, and Jose's decades of experience. We managed to get every single animal to safety before the creek overflowed its banks and turned the lower pastures into a temporary lake. We rode back to the house exhausted, soaked, and triumphant, sharing the kind of bond that only comes from facing impossible odds together. Word of that night spread through Millfield faster than the storm itself had passed. By the time I made it to the feed store the next afternoon, the conversation didn't stop when I walked in. Instead, several ranchers who'd never spoken to me before came over to shake my hand, to ask about the cattle, to offer help with cleanup and repairs. The owner, Helen Walker, refused to let me pay for the supplies I needed, saying anyone who'd worked that hard to save Lionel's stock was welcome to whatever help she could provide. It wasn't instant acceptance, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, as I learned more about ranch management and proved myself capable of handling the daily challenges, the community's attitude gradually shifted from skepticism to cautious approval to something approaching genuine welcome. I started attending the monthly Cattlemen's Association meetings, joined the volunteer fire department, even helped organize the annual county fair. The ranch itself began to reflect my growing confidence and connection to the place. I repaired the sagging porch, repainted the house, and restored my grandmother's flower gardens using seeds I found stored in the barn. The changes were small but significant, signs that I was thinking of the place as home rather than just temporary shelter. Jose became more than just a foreman, evolving into the mentor and father figure I'd never had. He taught me to read the weather, to understand cattle behavior, to repair equipment and manage finances. But more than that, he shared stories about Lionel, about my mother, about the ranch's history and traditions. Through his memories, I began to understand the man who had left me everything and the family I'd never known. The first anniversary of Lionel's death fell on a crisp October morning, with the kind of clear blue sky that makes Texas look infinite. I spent the day visiting his grave in the Millfield Cemetery, then driving around the ranch boundaries, seeing the land through eyes that had learned to appreciate its beauty and understand its challenges. It was my land now, legally and emotionally, but it was also his legacy, his final gift to a grandson he'd never met but always loved. That evening, I sat in his chair on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful to be real. The metal box sat beside me, empty now but still precious as a container that had held the key to my identity, my history, my future. Inside the house, dinner was waiting, prepared by Andrea Thompson, a teacher from town who'd become something more than a friend over the past few months. The loneliness that had defined my first 17 years felt like a distant memory, replaced by connections and responsibilities and the deep satisfaction that comes from belonging somewhere. I had a home, a community, a purpose, and the knowledge that I was carrying forward something important that had been entrusted to my care. 5 years have passed since that first phone call changed my life, and I'm sitting in the same kitchen where I first held the metal box, but everything else has transformed. The house now echoes with different sounds: the laughter of children, the comfortable conversation of a family that's chosen each other rather than being bound by blood alone. Andrea and I married 3 years ago, and our son, named Lionel, in honor of the grandfather he'll never meet, is learning to walk on the same floors where his great-aunt Sarah took her first steps decades ago. The ranch has prospered under my management, growing from 300 head of cattle to nearly 500, expanding into new markets and sustainable practices that would have made Lionel proud. Jose remains my partner in the operation, though he's talking about retirement and training his own son to take over some of his responsibilities. The continuity of generations working the same land, caring for the same animals, maintaining the same traditions. But success isn't measured only in cattle or acres or profit margins. It's measured in the Christmas mornings when the house fills with friends who've become family, in the summer evenings when neighbors gather on the porch to share stories and watch storms build on the horizon, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this place will continue long after I'm gone, cared for by people who understand its value. The metal box sits in my study now, displayed on a shelf alongside other family treasures. Sometimes visitors ask about it, and I tell them the story of a dying rancher who left everything to a grandson he'd never met, who trusted that love could transcend time and distance and the mistakes that had kept them apart. It's a story that seems impossible until you live it, Until you understand that family isn't always about blood, but about choice, about commitment, about the willingness to build something together that's larger than any individual life. Zachary Reyes never did understand that. He moved to California after losing the legal challenge, cutting all ties with Texas and the family legacy he'd tried to claim through litigation rather than love. I heard recently that he's doing well in real estate development, building the kind of subdivisions that turn ranch land into suburbs, erasing the history that makes places special. I don't hold grudges, but I'm grateful that Lionel's vision for this land survived his nephew's ambitions. The key that unlocked the metal box hangs in my study too, mounted in a frame alongside a photograph of Lionel and Martha Rodriguez on their wedding day. They look impossibly young and hopeful, unaware of the heartbreak and loss that lay ahead, but also unaware of the joy and redemption that would eventually follow. Love doesn't always work out the way we plan, but it has a way of finding its own path, of creating connections across time and space that seem miraculous until you accept them as simply true. Last month, I received a letter from a social worker in Dallas asking if I'd be willing to consider fostering a teenager who was aging out of the system. A 17-year-old boy with no family, no connections, no safety net, waiting beyond the institutional walls that had contained his childhood. The parallels were too obvious to ignore, the circle too perfect to dismiss as coincidence. His name is Jeremy Allen, and he arrived last week with everything he owned packed into 2 garbage bags in an expression I recognized from my own reflection years ago. Wariness mixed with hope, determination tempered by the fear of disappointment. The careful emotional armor that protects kids who've learned not to expect too much from adults who make promises they might not keep. I showed him to the guest room that had been my first bedroom in this house, helped him unpack his belongings into the same dresser where I'd once stored my own meager possessions. The view from his window looks out over the same pastures where I learned to work cattle, toward the same horizon that had seemed so impossibly wide when I first arrived here, with nothing but questions in the hope that I might finally belong somewhere. He's cautious around the ranch work, uncertain about his ability to learn skills that seem foreign to someone who's spent his life in urban environments. But I see flashes of the same determination that carried me through those first difficult months, the same willingness to try, even when success seems unlikely. Jose has taken him under his wing with the same patient guidance he once showed me, teaching him to read cattle behavior and weather patterns and the 100 small details that make the difference between success and failure in ranch life. At dinner last night, Jeremy asked me about the metal box, about the story behind my inheritance, about how someone could leave everything to a stranger. I told him what I've learned over the past 5 years, that love doesn't always follow the patterns we expect, that family can be created through choice and commitment as much as through genetics, that sometimes the most important gifts come from people we never had the chance to thank. He listened with the intensity of someone hungry for hope, for proof that his own story might have a different ending than the one he's been expecting. I can't promise him a ranch or an inheritance, can't guarantee that his future will mirror mine in any specific way. But I can offer him what Lionel offered me, what this community offered me, what this land has taught me about belonging and purpose, and the satisfaction that comes from caring for something larger than yourself. The metal box that once held the key to my identity now represents something different, a symbol of the connections that bind us across time and space, the love that persists even when it can't be expressed directly, the hope that every ending might also be a beginning. It reminds me that we're never really alone, that our stories are always part of larger narratives that include people we haven't met yet, places we haven't discovered yet, possibilities we haven't imagined yet. This morning, Jeremy helped me move cattle to a new pasture, working with the quiet concentration of someone learning to trust his own abilities. He's still awkward on horseback, still uncertain about reading the animal's behavior, but he's improving every day. More importantly, he's beginning to smile, to ask questions that suggest he's thinking about the future rather than just surviving the present. Watching him reminds me of my own journey from that gray February morning when Martha Bailey called me to the phone, to this moment when I can offer another lost kid the chance to find his place in the world. It's not the same story, won't follow the same path, but it's connected by the same fundamental truth that Lionel understood when he left everything to a grandson he'd never met. Love finds a way, even across impossible distances, even through the barriers we build to protect ourselves from disappointment. The ranch will continue long after I'm gone, cared for by people who understand its value and are willing to work for its preservation. Maybe Jeremy will be part of that future. Maybe he'll find his path leads somewhere else entirely. Either way, he'll carry with him the knowledge that he matters, that he belongs, that his story is part of something larger and more meaningful than the circumstances that brought him here. If you're watching this and you've ever felt forgotten, ever wondered if you matter to anyone, ever doubted that your life has purpose or meaning, I want you to know that you're wrong. Somewhere in ways you might never discover, you're connected to people and places and possibilities that are waiting for you to find them. Your story isn't over. Your family might not be the one you were born into, and the place where you belong might be somewhere you haven't imagined yet. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from what your own story of finding family or home looks like. Whether you've ever received an unexpected gift that changed your life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone, that their story matters, that love has a way of reaching across any distance to find the people who need it most. The metal box sits on my shelf, empty but still precious, a reminder that the most important things we inherit aren't always the ones we can hold in our hands. Sometimes they're the stories we tell, the love we pass forward, the hope we offer to the next person who needs to believe that they belong somewhere, that they matter to someone, that their life has meaning and purpose, and the potential to become something beautiful. That's the real treasure Lionel left me, not the ranch or the cattle or the house, but the understanding that we're all connected, that love persists even when it can't be expressed directly, that every ending is also a beginning if we have the courage to turn the page and start writing the next chapter of our lives.